Okay, we're going to get started. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I have a pretty loud voice. I don't even know if I need the mic. We're still waiting for one more of our panelists, Teshima Walker, but we're going to get started without her. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out this afternoon. The topic of our discussion with the panelists is going to be the mission of Black radio, and is it being fulfilled? So I'm going to take a brief moment to introduce our esteemed guests. As I said, Teshima Walker is in here. To my left, to my right, Todd Burroughs, Dr. Todd Burroughs. He's an independent researcher and scholar. He's been a professional journalist since 1985. He's written articles for magazines such as The Source, Color Lines, Black Issues Book Review, and The Crisis, and also websites such as The Black World Today and Black America Web. And he has a PhD in communication from my alma mater, the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism, and he's currently writing a journalistic biography of Mumia Abu-Jamal, correct?
Correct.
Okay, to my left is Allison Keyes, who everyone in this room knows. She's a general assignment reporter for NPR's National Desk. Allison is an award-winning journalist with almost 20 years of experience in print, radio, and television. She spent several years working in New York, first at WCBS News Radio, and then covering City Hall and politics for WNYC. She was recognized by the Newswomen's Club of New York with an award for her eyewitness reports on the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And in 2002, Allison joined NPR as a reporter and substitute host for the Tavis Smiley Show. She then went on to work with Ed Gordon and Farai Chideya. And then she moved to News and Notes when it debuted in January 2005. And now she's back here with us. And last but certainly not least, to my far left is Glen Ford. He's executive editor of Black Agenda Reports. And he's also the son, if anyone in this room remembers that far back, of famed radio personality Rudy the Deuce Rutherford, who was the first black man to host a non-gospel TV show in the Deep South in Columbus, Georgia, back in 1958. And Glen's first full-time broadcasting news job was at James Brown's Augusta radio station in 1970. And in 1977, Mr. Ford co-launched, produced, and hosted America's Black Forum. And it was the first nationally syndicated black news interview program on commercial television. And they all have long resumes, but it'd take a lot of time to go over. So I'm going to throw out the first question, and I'll throw it out to my right. What do you see as the mission or role of black radio today?
Well, the key word is today.
Right.
Because there's a tradition and then there's today. I'll talk about the tradition and then I'll talk about today. Today is as confusing as the mission of any other media organization, including NPR's. The tradition, though, was a very clear one. Black radio, and by black radio, the tradition starts with black voices being allowed on white radio stations. That developed into black people gaining some sort of financial and political independence because of their voices, to be allowed to organize black people and to use the medium as a way to organize black people. The tradition is a tradition in which you have a black DJ who was, in many cases, not only a DJ, but also a sock hop promoter. And I know that sounds kind of frivolous, but it was actually the money from the sock hops that allowed the DJ the financial independence to be on the radio, because they were so low paid, it was ridiculous. That, plus some of the payola, allowed them to be in a position to organize people politically. So the black DJ used the fact that he was able to reach hundreds of thousands of people who lived in segregated areas, people who could be doctors, as well as lawyers, as well as janitors, to organize politically around issues of common concern. So there's this long tradition of black radio which peaks in the 70s, in the post-riot era that Glen has written about, in which the white owners of these stations understood that they needed to, at best, find out what black people were doing, and at worst, monitor the political development of black people. So they created black newscasters. And so there were whole generations of black newscasters. Mumia Abu-Jamal was one of them in Philadelphia in the early 70s, way before he got to WUHY. there were black newscasters whose job it was to go out into the black community of the 1970s, find out what's going on, and to bring it back. And this is a peak area. So all of that starts to shift with many of the problems in terms of radio consolidation that we know about, more music, less talk, consolidation, and now we're in a confusing atmosphere in which the corporatization of quote-unquote black radio connected with the intergenerational now black radio. White-owned radio conglomerate that does hip-hop music and very little else, and sometimes the most negative hip-hop music. White corporations who have the soul classic gold format and do very little else. Black newscasters gone by the way of the dinosaur or by the way of other commercial radio newscasters. So you have a confusing situation that's even made more confusing by the advent of the internet, in which now anyone theoretically can now be a newspaper publisher, magazine publisher, internet radio producer. So you now have individuals trying to fill the gap, the historic tradition of black radio, in a way that works for very small niche audiences, if that makes any sense. I know it's a bit jumbled, but it's a long history that, because of external factors, has now been kind of fragmented and looking for a way in which to fulfill the tradition. I mean, Syndication One is a way to try to fulfill that tradition. I don't know if you know about Syndication One, but Syndication One is a little bit over a year old. It is a groundbreaking collaboration between two of the most powerful black people in media, CathyHughes of RadioOne and Television One, and Tom Joyner of the Tom Joyner Morning Show. His company, Reach Communications, combined with Radio and TV One to create something new, a nationally black syndicated news talk network that has actual programming that is national in scope in terms of terrestrial radio as well as internet radio. So
I'll stop you for a minute because that's a perfect segue for me to briefly introduce
right ahead.
Teshima, and I'm sure she can talk about it since she's the assistant program director there.
Yes, I have another point too.
Okay. Teshima Walker is assistant program director, as Dr. Todd Burroughs said, of Syndication One Inc., which is a division of Radio One. Teshima started her career at WBZ in Chicago in '96 and as an intern and then a producer. And during the presidential election of 2000, she served as a fellow here with NPR's All Things Considered. In 2003, she moved to the West Coast to produce the Tavis Smiley Show and then on to work with Ed Gordon. And now she's back on the East Coast to help with the mammoth task of building a black talk radio network with CathyHughes' Radio One.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I'm late. I don't know why I thought that it was 12:30, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And he's absolutely right. This is huge. I also want to introduce my boss, who's the program director for Syndication One, who came out of retirement in Chicago, but had stopped doing radio for a while. Lee Michaels has been in this business and worked with CathyHughes and Radio One before it was Radio One. Worked with WOL, has spent, 35 years or so in the business, Lee? And then Kirk Tanter, 600 years good. And then Kirk Tanter, who's the production director there, who has spent practically all of his career, except for maybe 3 years, I think he told me, with Black radio station, with Black Talk and news. So I had to bring them here because my knowledge of Black news radio in the commercial radio business is different. I came to the Syndication One because of this particular vision of providing news and information to Black people. That's the reason why I came. And it's been challenging work. But Lee and I and Kirk have also inherited XM radio. So we have terrestrial radio as well as satellite radio in terms of providing news and information, or news with an African American perspective, to Black people on satellite and on terrestrial, which is, the radio in your car, your home, et cetera. Okay.
Okay, Allison, I know you want to take that question, the mission of Black radio today.
Because actually, it's interesting, Teshima, that you said that, because almost the reason I got into radio, I grew up in Chicago, where every morning we listened to Lou Palmer, and he did this great radio. It was like the drums. It was like just like the talking drums of Africa. Here's Lou Palmer bringing you what's happening in the Black community. We were like, wow, this is how we knew what was going on the south and west sides of Chicago, which you didn't really get too much of on, shall we say, regular commercial radio. Wow, I cannot call another station for the life of me. But the TV stations didn't cover our community, as The Defender, Lou Palmer Show, Tom Joyner even, who started out in local radio in Chicago. But because I listened to those voices on the air, and because I was so disturbed by the coverage of our community, I was kind of like, wow, now what can I do to get paid to talk? And find a way for people to have a more positive view of our community, as opposed to watching Channel 7 and all you see is the people crying and the pink lights and the police tape, and then when somebody gets killed in a white neighborhood, you see lovely green shots and everybody's really, really scared, And I was always like, why does no one ever do the positive grandmother story? Why does no one do the positive grocery store story, the people that have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps? So that's one of the reasons that I got into radio. But you were saying, Todd, that external factors were among the things that were changing this. And I think it has a lot to do with internal factors either, because when they took the newscasters away from Black radio, we didn't protest in the streets as we should have. People are like, we're listening to Jay-Z and we don't know what's going on.
Right.
I mean, you go by the kids in the cars and the cars are doing this. They are not listening to the news. And it's a big problem that people at that age don't seem to realize there's a problem. So something has to be done about this.
Correct.
This is a perfect segue. I wanted to put this question out to Glen Ford, because I know he's written many passionate articles on this subject, and particularly the demise of Black news radio. And I read one of your quotes, and I just want to put it out to the panel, but I'm going to let you address it first. If Dr. King had been allowed to live, he would have long ago mobilized to save local Black radio news from the dustbin into which it has been cast by white and Black corporate owners. So what I want to put to you is, when you say you want more Black news, the demise of Black news, do you want stories particularly addressed to Black people? Or are you talking about incorporating us into mainstream news programming, such as NPR and other networks, and Clear Channel, which owns like a gazillion stations? Do you want news that basically empowers us, enriches us, and informs us in how we can partake into the dialogue on global warming, to politics, to the environment, to everything?
We still have some national Black news organization, so it's not that we don't have to recreate that wheel. What is news? What is a news judgment? What is important to my community is what a news judgment is about. It's not what's sexy to the community, it's what's important to the community. Sensational stories are news. They're not always that important, but they are subjectively important to a large element of the community. Zoning is not a very sexy story, but it's extremely important to whether there's going to be a community, our community, in that city. So the criteria in terms of news judgment is what is important to my community. So I can't give you a straight up answer on that. News people have to make that decision every day. What's core is, who am I serving? And that is the question. And that is the question in terms of Black radio. Who is it serving? Is it serving the Black community, interests that are important to the Black community, or is it serving the ownership? Well, of course it's serving the ownership. These are all corporations, and this is America. And the only intervention in that kind of situation is people power, to mobilize people. But how do you mobilize people when their primary information network, which is radio, Black radio reaching 80% plus Black households, fantastic penetration. There is nothing like it in America. Not Latino radio, certainly not general white radio, which is cut up into all kinds of segments and mini segments. Nothing as powerful in terms of format as Black radio, which is why when you go into almost any market, you will see at the top, even if the Black population in that market is only 10% for a market, you will see the Black radio stations clustered at the top because of the intense loyalty of that community. But we do not see reciprocity in terms of that loyalty. Now, I'd like to start off with a little anecdote which will sound like the ramblings of an old man. But
I just want you to clarify something. When you're saying black radio, you're talking
black-oriented radio.
urban stations in top markets, even if they're owned not even by black
I
men,
don't
but
care
Clear
who
Channel.
owns them. It's
Right.
the mission
urban
that is
stations.
important.
Okay.
And where the audience, the targeted audience, whatever you call it, is black. Remember, the advertisers all know, so nobody's fooling anybody with these euphemisms. Beginning with urban, which I'm sure Todd could explain in some detail.
You were there, Glenn. So
I was
you can
there.
explain it too.
I was there when they had their Eureka moment at WBLS. They did a study, and they found that 45% of WBLS New York's audience was non-black. Wow, what a revelation, right? And then they decided that since they had all these non-black people listening to WBLS, they should call it something different. We all used to think BLS meant Black Liberation Station.
It's true.
In New York, that's what he meant.
That's true.
Even when it was owned by a guy named Katz, K-A-T-Z, all right?
Right.
But it was that good, that relevant, that moving, that important, an outlet. But when they discovered there was 45% non-black listenership, they changed it to this new thing called urban. Now they have urban stations all over Mississippi. You know, all those metropolises they have, like Columbus, Mississippi, Vicksburg, Mississippi, big urban. So they use that urban euphemism. They now have many. And they decided that they would alter their programming to cater to that 45%. Now, somehow that does not compute. That's counterintuitive. If you find that you have 45% of your listenership non-white, this must be non-black people, rather, who like listening to black stations. You know, why would you change their programming? They tuned into WBLS to hear the music and the news and the ambiance. That's why they're there in 45% strength. Why would you change it? For them, they didn't want the change. All right, so. It's a 2-hour-long subject talking about what is black radio, but the definition, as far as I'm concerned, is radio outlets that are targeted to or predominantly the black audience. Now I'm going to do my old man's anecdote. All right. In 1970, I got out of the Army, and I realized that I could do nothing except talk on the radio and jump out of airplanes. And so, obviously, my only option was to talk on the radio. So my first job was with James Brown's radio station in Augusta, Georgia. I got there at 6 o'clock in the morning. I was told that, there's your newswire machine, there's your microphone, there's your recording equipment, and up there on the wall is a list of all the big black folks in town. So when things happen, you know, you ask them what they think.
Right.
Oh, by the way, your name is Ford. My real name is Rutherford. But, you know, I needed that job. So I've been Glen Ford ever since. As soon as the station manager walked out of the room, I went up to the list of all the big black folks in town and looked at it, and it was Reverend this, Bishop that, the Right Reverend Doctor this. It was almost entirely preachers. I said, damn, another theocracy. I said, I'm not having this. So I tore the list down. First thing I did, I spent the next week immersing myself in the community to see, okay, now who are the real leaders here in this community? Remember, Augusta was a total backwater in 1970. Not one black council person, all right? It was really a throwback even for that time. So I found out, well, who is, and I know she's there, that rather large black woman in public housing who's always raising all the hell. Now, you know she's there.
Exactly.
All right?
Exactly.
She's always there.
That's right. That's right.
I needed to find her. All right? So I found her, and she became my expert on housing conditions and conditions of quality of life in general. And who is the person or persons who every time a brother gets shot down by the police, he jumps up?
True.
Right? They're always there too.
Pound curlers in his hair.
Right? Well, I had to find him, and it was easy to find him, and a few of them, in fact. Now, who is the brother? Usually a brother. He's a black businessman, and he's always talking about how come the white folks get all the contracts and blah, 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 and that because they're always there. And I found him, and on until I had 10 people who could answer any question that arose from the local news wire about a development or proposal affecting Augusta. Remember, we don't have city council people. We don't have all that. All we have is the right reverends and the bishops and things like that. All right, but who actually is a leader, all right, in these areas? And so I called them the Committee of 10. That was informal. Nobody knew that except me, all right? And from then on, they were on the air at James Brown's radio station, the only full-time black station at that time in Augusta, every day. Every time something about housing came up, well, you know my girl down there in projects. Every time something dealing with the criminal justice system, I knew who to call. Every time there was a development issue, I knew who to call. And I swear, within 2 weeks, these committee of 10 people were the black leadership of Augusta, Georgia. They must be. They're on the radio all the time. Their statements are packaged in news. Right. And I know them. Right? Changed the political architecture of Augusta, Georgia in 2 weeks. Blew my mind. I had not even intended to go into news because I saw how much money my father made and how many pretty women followed him around as a disc jockey. That's what I wanted to do.
You know, Tom Jordan was originally a newscaster, but he found that out, and he switched. Because he got tired of the brothers in the Dashikis going, yeah, good, brother. But the DJs were getting all the women, all the money.
That's right.
That's exactly what happened.
That's right.
Yeah.
But when after 2 weeks I saw that how quickly the transformation politically had occurred. It occurred so quickly, in fact, that I let the better reverends back on, 2 or 3 of them, back on the radio. You see what I'm saying? And they all had to ask before being allowed back on. Once I saw that and how it was almost instantaneous, I was hooked. I said, this is what this medium can do. Now, you know, I mean, we have emerged from Jim Crow. We've passed all the necessary legislation. Now we have to reorganize our communities to reflect this brand new world that exists. It even exists for Augusta, Georgia. Augusta just doesn't know it yet. All right? But we will show how a new leadership functions, a post-Jim Crow leadership functions, and a non-theocratic leadership functions. And that's where my career began, and everything else is an extension of that moment. So that's my old man's.
Well, it's killing me right now that we don't have a tape of this story you just told. I'm going to ask you to do this again privately with me later. But what I want to say, just to put on my little academic hat for a minute, that's the extension of black political socialization that radio provided. Radio did something in the 60s and 70s that I think too many people found out about, which is why they shut it down.
Right.
What he was saying was that was an extension of the mass meetings. Those in the urban areas may remember the street corner
the barbershop.
speakers. Right, the barbershop, the church hall. See, once black radio came on the scene and people like Glen were paid as a job to go out and gather that sound and gather up that political socialization, that allowed a common dialogue and a common community analysis that went literally through the air into these boxes of people who had PhDs and no degrees, and people who cared, as you said in the post-civil rights movement, about the development of the black community. So when you give a large amount of people like that a common denominator of information, they actually have a common point in which to struggle. And that's why it got shut down.
And it was also about having the power to choose our own leaders instead of going through the filters of Fox News going, well, we can have this woman on the air because she's light-skinned enough not to really frighten our white listeners, and she's conservative enough, you know, that she can look like a spokesman for the black community, but she doesn't live in the black community, she doesn't know anybody in the black community, none of that. You know, whereas the reporters at the black stations knew and lived in the community, so we knew who to talk to, you know, like he said. Same woman at the housing project, there was one at every housing project. The woman that lived on 79th and King Drive that could tell you what was going on in a 5-mile radius around that neighborhood. And frankly, when you went to a white station, they would send you out there anyway because the white people weren't going to go, and they weren't going to get the same kind of information that we were going to get. So being able to choose our leaders and hear what our leaders were saying was a very important thing that I think we're seriously lacking now, because everyone's thinking they're still the big three or the big two. How many now? Let's see, Jesse, Obama, and who is it these days? But nobody is going into the neighborhoods the way people did when I was growing up and finding out what's happening out there, which is a huge loss to us, I think.
I want to put this to Teshima because, as everyone conceded earlier, you're working for, if not the most powerful black woman who started her own radio network, unless Oprah decides to buy up, and create a radio network, it's CathyHughes. What do you see as the mission, hearing all this? How important is incorporating news? I know your boss is sitting over there, in this entire network.
Well, there are a couple of things, because I think people have to really be aware of where I've come from when I came to RadioOne. When I worked at NPR on the Tavis Smiley Show, there was this struggle between activism and journalism, and which one would rule out. They hired Tavis Smiley, knowing full well that he wasn't a journalist in the tradition that, some folks would consider a journalist here. He was an activist, which was smart on NPR's part. They probably didn't know that because that's the history of black radio. And because he would bring important issues of the African American community to the airwaves and talk to people about those issues. One of the things he would always tell us is he doesn't have to give both sides because the one side had not been covered for so long. He was going to talk to the side that had not had a voice. Okay, so, but then again, there was the struggle because we had to present, or there was the constant push, and many of us considered ourselves, of course, to be journalism, the who, what, when, where, why, how, and we were determined to get that information against what we knew was sort of the history of our people in radio. So then I come to RadioOne, where they hired a professor, Professor Michael Eric Dyson, who does his show daily from 10 to 1. He is a college professor, intellectual. Okay, he's curious. That was good for me. Reverend Al Sharpton comes on from 1 until 4. He's a reverend, he's an activist. That made me a little bit nervous because I'm trying to figure out, am I going to be able to cover both sides and provide my people, black people, with enough information, not that we can decide for them, but so that they can decide for themselves. Exactly. That's important to me. So the struggle then became, my boss would encourage me to sort of lay back because I would push the staffs. Both of the executive producers did not have journalism backgrounds. One who worked with Reverend Sharpton had a activism background. He was grassroots. I had an opportunity to go to New York and see him actually interact with people who were affected by issues that needed a voice on the air. So I'm starting to rethink how news is presented, but I always caution the executive producers to provide the factual information. How much can we be sure that the community knows first about the issue, and how can we educate them to provide them with the resources so that they can learn more for themselves, not just to force feed them, but what I find out too is that people that call and they have questions, they need resources. They need someone to help them. Where can I go to get X, Y, and Z? My son is in prison. I can't afford this. How can I be helped? And is that our responsibility? Yes, it is, because that is what CathyHughes has determined as our mission. We not only provide news and information, but we provide assistance, guidance, resources.
Which has always been the mission.
Which is right.
I'm glad you mentioned Sharpton's show because I'm going to tell a young person, or a relatively young person's story. Sharpton is going chapter and verse of the black radio I grew up with in New York City. In New York, you had Percy Sutton, who owned a FM radio station. Percy Sutton was Malcolm X's lawyer, state assemblyman, kind of a black political kingmaker. He had an FM station called WBLS, which Glen talked about the transition of. But he also had this AM station called WLIB. And in 1981, as a response to the Reagan administration, WLIB became a black news talk radio station. WLIB had a very specific mission. It was to organize black people politically so that they could elect a black mayor. And so from 1981 to when David Dinkins was elected in 1989, WLIB was a place in which you learned about black political organization. I was in college and I was at home and I would pretend to get up and go to school, so my mom would think I was in school. I would listen to WLIB all day. Then, walk around the block, come back, pretend I was in college all day, because it provided such a militant, leftist, nationalist, Pan-Africanist orientation. They did not care about sponsors. They lost sponsors right and left. And WBLS, because it was not yet crumbled by all of the consolidation in terms of the mega white corporations around it, was able to subsidize WLIB. And I know RadioOne has a similar story with WOL. But in terms of WLIB, you had activists who were hosts, but who were also professional radio people. And I think, Syndication One is probably getting used to that, because they have activists on the air instead of trained radio people. But imagine trained radio people who were activists, right, who produced very strong militant shows. And if they invited somebody from the other side on, it was just to give the audience a chance to attack that person for being so stupid as to coming on a black leftist, black nationalist radio show talking all of that mess. This was a radio station that was not afraid in the late 80s to use Malcolm X in their commercials. And so that gives you an idea, and this is before Malcolm became a postage stamp. Well. So it gives you an idea of the orientation that when white people, frankly, are not involved, and it's about black people organizing themselves and not worrying about terms that make white people feel comfortable, what can be put together in terms of education, in terms of political socialization, in terms of cultural socialization. And that's the kind of radio that I was brought up with, and that's the kind of radio that I hope Syndication One will try to continue. Now, I am going to do a critique of Syndication One. One of the main differences between WLIB and Syndication One was that WLIB had a street reporter. So I remember on my graduation day, coming back from graduation, taking a nap, and I had WLIB on, and all of a sudden I'm hearing Dominic Carter, who now with New York One. Dominic Carter is on the street in Brooklyn talking about a black guy who had gotten beaten up by some white people by attending some sort of party. It was one of the major racial incidents. But I remember literally that day, because Dominic Carter was everywhere in New York. True. If there was a racial incident, if a brother had gotten beaten up or shot by the cops, he was there on the scene. And I hope Syndication One
let me respond to that because I'm glad that you brought that up. Sure. We are, as he mentioned before, we're a year old. January 20-something. So my boss fought really very hard, Lee Michaels, to bring us two reporters. What I'm in the process of doing, if I had enough money, I would steal Allison from you all right today. Just want to let you all know that.
How much, yo?
But we have 3 part-time reporters. We have not been able to get the money for a full-time person. And so what I am committed to do, we just made this transition with XM, so we're trying to get our arms around who the people are that are on that satellite station every single day, so we can figure out what they're talking about, does it make sense, who follows what, who does what. So there are some things currently about news I know that we're going to have to change. We have to sit down and talk about that mission. We have to figure out, like you said, who is the community that we serve? Who are the people in those communities? Because we're on 30-something stations across the country. So even at our affiliate stations, we're trying to build relationships so that we can encourage them to put pieces together to put on our air. At one point, when I had to produce the Michael Eric Dyson show, every week we talked to I lost my train of thought right there. Okay. Michael Eric Dyson show. We talked to the affiliate stations every week, right, to find out what was going on in that particular community. Because I think it's important to connect Black people from all over the country about what's happening in the South, in the North, in the East, in the West, because it makes you think about the world in a very different way. It takes you out of your community. It allows you to empathize, sympathize with people who are going through some of the same struggles, who may have a different way of handling it. So we're sharing information. So we're attempting to do that, and we're going to make that stronger. I just need some time because we don't have an editor, we don't have the system or the infrastructure in place like you do here at NPR, but we're working on it.
I'm curious as to how we re-engage a community that is more concerned about what's going on with Jay-Z and Beyonce.
I don't agree with that.
Into listening to the news again. I'm curious as to how we address that.
When I think about our station in Atlanta, we're on FM. We have many 20, 17-year-old college students that call in. I think it has something to do with, where we are on the dial. When we're on FM, we have young people that call in and talk about the issues that are taking place in those communities. It goes beyond Jay-Z and hip-hop music. Right. It really does, but I think that because of what we see or hear on a daily basis, or maybe because I'm inside of that community that I have to serve, I see something different. And I am encouraged by it. We have young people that come and talk to Lee on a daily basis that are 20-something years old that want to do street reporting, that want to have their own talk shows so they can tell you about what's happening in those communities, about police brutality or how hard it is for young black men to find jobs, investigative stuff. They want to do it. We just don't have the money right now to fund those shows.
I want to throw this out there, Allison, because I'm glad we could all debate about this for an hour. I'm just going to throw out these names: Tom Joyner, Doug Banks, you name them, Steve Harvey. Mm-hmm. We have issues on our own, top stations with these hosts that are really powerful. Mm-hmm. They're nationally syndicated, and it's like we can argue about it amongst ourselves. Sometimes I'm driving in the morning. I don't just listen to NPR. I listen to everything.
Right.
If I'm listening to Steve Harvey, I'm cringing. And I'm thanking God that none of my white colleagues are sitting in the seat next to me.
Right. So Tom does try to deal.
Okay, but what about all these powerful disc jockeys who have these nationally syndicated shows? Like you said, the majority of black people are listening. This is where they're getting their news from and their information. What about the responsibility?
Well, first of all, they're not getting news. News is not talk. Talk without news is uninformed talk.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, that we really must understand that, because I hear constantly news and talk used interchangeably.
Right.
When I know for a fact there is no news on black radio.
Exactly.
Not on RadioOne. There is no news. There is a lot of talk. Todd was talking about WLIB and its relationship to WBLS. An important point here was that when much of the talk and some news actually went to WLIB, the small AM station, WBLS, all right, the flagship station, continued to have a full-time news crew. That was the moneymaker, but you had regular spot news. A corporation has a news commitment, is serving that community, not when it has off to the side an AM station in which all these talk shows are crowded but no news. All right.
Right.
But when it's money-making stations, the stations our people actually listen to, have regular newscasts. All right? The ghettoization within a ghettoization of talk and then still no news does not satisfy the bill.
And see, that's the beginning, as you know, Glenn, of the more music, less talk movement, because that was done by radio programmers who created this thing called urban radio, which was a way to de-racialize and therefore depoliticize black radio. And that was done purposely.
Yes.
That was not accidentally done. That was done as a reaction of the development of black political socialization from black radio.
And I want to make another thing clear that only older folk will remember, and that doesn't make us smart. We just still here. There were in 1973, and you were talking about three part-time people, and I'm convinced of your personal commitment to doing news. I really am. In 1973, in Washington, D.C., we had a black radio press corps of 21
Really?
people, all from just 3 black-oriented stations. WOL, where I was, 5 people. WOOK, our competitor, 4. And WHUR, 12. All right?
Wow.
And by the way,
more people than are on this side of the room. I mean, we were a press corps.
That's
all
fabulous.
By the way,
that did not count all the other black folks working for white radio and white television and all that.
just 10 seconds, because and a lot of those people were correspondents for 3 national black radio news networks, NBN, National Black Network, Sheridan Broadcasting Network, and Mutual Broadcasting Network. So you had that local national thing you're trying to put together. That's been done before, and we need to go back to the people who have done that in order to set that up. Because Mumia was a reporter for black radio in Philadelphia, but he also was a reporter for National Black Network. He was a Philadelphia correspondent. I just wanted to add that in to just show that power that we used to have.
Now, I also want to point out that in 1973, there were only 30 black-owned stations in the entire country. So this explosion of black news had nothing to do with black ownership. I really want to make that clear, because there's a myth out there, based in no fact at all, that somehow spontaneously black ownership leads to more serious services to the black community. It does not. History shows it does not.
Right.
However, back in 73, we all assumed that it did. I didn't, but everybody else did. And so black people's political capital, since we already had our black news, and I guess we assumed we always would, put all their political capital into ownership, based on the assumption that with increased black ownership, we would get more better news. Instead, what we got was the same thing we get in terms of news from white corporations, which is none. And I'm going to, we're running out of time. I just wanted to shoot my big shot here. At media reform conferences, which are mostly white things, and that's sad. The devil is Clear Channel. All you have to do at one of those media reform gatherings is say Clear Channel, ooh, 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 you know, that's it. All right, and Clear Channel deserves to be the devil, but in black America, the biggest footprint in terms of corporate ownership and no newsness is not Clear Channel, which owns only about 51 black-oriented stations. It is RadioOne, which owns 69 black-oriented radio stations. And in terms of news, Clear Channel's policy and RadioOne's policy are identical. All right. So I have a big battle going into these media reform conferences, trying to get them to attach to put as much emphasis on the corporatization, the consolidation that exists in black radio as they do in white radio, because that's a form of racism. The predominant position in media reform is that black radio needs more black ownership, and I think black radio needs some. Not more, because we don't have any. Some news more than more black owners.
On that note, we only have about 10 minutes left. I was afraid we were going to need 2 hours for this. I know Felix has had his hand up, so I want to take some questions from the audience. Just go for it. I'll point. Felix?
I just had a quickie. What channel on that channel?
169, The Power.
Come on, Teshima, say that stronger.
Mike, I think you have up here as well.
You go.
Well, you were talking
Tessa.
You were talking about the power of the DJ to mobilize, and we saw that with the mass mobilization of Latino listeners with El Sol in Los Angeles. So I was wondering if someone would like to address why that's happening, and yet that power has ebbed away from the black radio stations, given they have better penetration.
Really briefly, black radio acted like those demonstrations didn't happen. There were millions of people in the streets, and with no news department, black radio didn't cover it. And it was appalling.
Yes, we did.
Okay.
I'm like,
y'all did, but I didn't hear it on non-Radio One stations. I didn't hear it.
And I guess that's what we need to talk about. Where When black people are listening to radio programming these days, where are you tuning in to get your information? Are you also tuning in to listen to the jams and snap your fingers? We are out there. When, as a matter of fact, I remember the first day it happened, when the Latino community hit the streets. I called Reverend Sharpton, who had one of his directors of his national action network out in the field, and he put the telephone to many of the protesters that were in the streets. We were one of the first, in my opinion, that dealt with that particular issue when the mainstream media was not dealing with it. Sure. I'm curious what Mr. Ford believes is news, because I do understand that the difference between news and talk, and what he would like to see us do at Syndication One, and if you've listened to the programming.
News is what is delivered by a news department.
Right.
That's what it is. It's not, news is not just someone giving some version of information. You have a news department. Of course, there are norms of journalism. There are norms of reporting. I think, and they're not that difficult. Actually, I don't think there should be journalism schools. There should be schools of English.
True.
And then subcategories of, well, here's how common sense and fairness is presented using the good English language within this format or the other. But you don't have news departments at, Radio One, the 69 station constellation, does not have news departments.
We'd have to figure out how to pay for it.
I want to point out. I want to say one thing. Teshima, I was not attacking Radio One. My point was that the KISS FMs and those stations didn't cover it. I know Radio One did, but I don't know. In my neighborhood in Southwest Washington, I don't generally hear people listening to satellite radio. Do you know what I'm saying? The people on my floor and the people that drive by my building are listening to KISS. So I wasn't attacking you guys for not covering it, but I'm pointing out that generally
a better way of interacting with the FM stations.
Yes.
Now I will agree with that.
Yes. You're going to hang on a second because we got another Lee. Okay.
Well, I just want to say that there is a distinction between news and news talk. Syndication One is news talk. We do provide news twice an hour, top and the bottom, the way we used to do in the old days. We do 2 minutes at the top, 2 minutes at the bottom. We are not trying to be a news network. We are a news talk network. Syndicated programs more than a Mutual or back in the days of Sheraton and all of that. So that's not our claim. That's not our position. We're a syndication company that has programming, but along with those programs, we do provide news. Unlike most syndicators, they give you the program, you do your news if you want to.
Right.
This whole news evaporation started during the deregulation period during the Reagan administration, when the rules of the amount of public service announcements, news per week, etc., went away. The owners, simultaneously, the ownership changed in the business. It became investment bankers as opposed to the local owner that owned a radio station in Joe Blow, Mississippi, or New York, or whatever market for that matter. When they found out that we could make 55% margins of profit in radio, every bandit and banshee jumped into the industry, and it changed the complexion forevermore. That was the birth of what we know as today as the Clear Channels and even Radio One to a certain degree. The problem is when the FCC deregulated the rules and said, Mr. Broadcaster, you are not obligated by what how you're licensed in terms of the number of hours of news, public affairs programmings, and public service announcements. They didn't tell you, the public, that it's up to you to mandate to that broadcaster whether or not they're doing enough or they're doing the wrong information. So it's really up to you, the listeners, to mandate to the Federal Communications Commission that you're not happy with what you're hearing or not hearing. So you possess the power, but they didn't tell you. They deregulated, said, Mr. Broadcaster, we're going to trust you that you're going to make the best judgment call. But look, It's all about the bottom line. The bottom line is when you had news departments the way Glen described and some of those stations, and I ran some of them myself, we had 4 or 5 people. Well, when you looked at that category at the end of the year and you're doing budgets, you said, well, here's $300,000 in the news department that generates $75,000 in income or $100,000 or it breaks even. They eliminated it. That's what happened. Not with any kind of other motive other than bottom line. Mm-hmm. And the wrong people owned the radio stations. They bought it for the bottom line effect, not the commitment. The Egmont Sonderlings and the Katzes and some of those old broadcasters who got in it to serve the public interest, those guys are gone. They're history.
Lee, I'm going to have to give you a time here. Sorry. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions?
2.5 hours the next time.
Yes.
My question sort of dovetails off of that. I mean, the deregulation that you were just describing also allowed CathyHughes to build RadioOne. And the impetus should also be on her and Liggins and everybody else to provide the community with what it needs. Exactly. To tell us that we need to be petitioning the FCC, which some of us do to no avail,
right?
And put it on us is
cop out.
Is a cop out. Absolutely, is a cop out. And to address something that Allison raised earlier, you are absolutely right. I live in D.C. I teach in Baltimore. RadioOne in Baltimore is killing young people. KISS here is killing young people. They follow the same mandates. They play the same garbage hip-hop. Local hip-hop in this city cannot get heard on the radio. Political progressive artists cannot be heard on the radio.
True.
We have people doing songs about free D.C. and end colonialism in this city, end gentrification, bring healthcare east of the river. They can't get those songs on the radio because the same playlists are funneled right through RadioOne. And I think it is totally unfair to suggest that RadioOne can make all this money in their commercial FM outlets and then say, despite your commitment as an individual, that we can't provide the information that these young people need. These young people that come into my classrooms have been listening to this nonsense since they were 10, 11, 9 years old. That's why they're more interested in Jay-Z, because that's all they hear. And they hear Jay-Z every hour on the hour, thousands of times in the week. They don't hear anything else. And that is not on us as a community. That is absolutely on CathyHughes and the ownership of RadioOne and everybody else.
And Keith Murphy doing 2 minutes at the beginning with ABC Feeds is not news.
We have Sydney, I see you waving furiously in the back. Let's get the mic to him.
Whatever it is, it's not news.
Let me just pick up on where Lee left off. What really changes the way stations are financed? When the venture capitalists got into this business, when he talked about it, the dynamics change because you have to meet these covenants at the end of 3 months or 6 months, and if you, as an owner, if you can't meet them, you're out of business. They will replace you with new ownership. That's just the way the business is right now. Even at CathyHughes level, if she cannot meet the covenants from the venture capitalists at the end of the 6 months, she will be replaced with new Clear Channel. Now own only 14% of Clear Channel. Tomorrow is the deadline for the sale of 448 radio stations from their 1,100 stations that they owned 6 months ago, because because of the way the business is financed. It's a totally different business from when it was family business back in the 80s.
I have one point to make. Insofar as hip-hop, I think a lot of people are focusing. I'm Kirk Tanter, from Network Production Director of Syndication One. What people aren't stating in their literature and what have you is how hip-hop stations came about in the first place. They came about in the first place because, first of all, black radio said, we ain't playing no hip-hop. We're not playing no rap. We ain't doing none of that. White stations already said that hip-hop is poison, okay? Then all of a sudden, at one point in time, KISS, for one station in L.A., not the one out here, in the 80s, they decided, all of a sudden they're going to play 50% black music. Before, it was they're only rotating Lionel Richie with Diana Ross, and when they play out, then they'll play Michael Jackson or what have you. Okay, that's what was happening back, in the 70s and early 80s. When Kiss in L.A. went to half R&B, everybody was like, whoa. But the result of them going half R&B was that they had double-digit ratings, which is unheard of. They had double-digit ratings for about 4 or 5 consecutive years. Okay, then those stations that said, oh, well, we ain't playing no hip-hop, they started playing hip-hop. And guess who the stations were owned by? Okay, they were owned by white media. Okay, they decided they're going to play hip-hop all day, which is called churban, which is called rhythmic. Okay, they didn't call it urban because urban meant black. Okay, so they called it something different, and they shot to the top of the charts. Okay, in every major market there was. Hip-hop became playable. Okay, it was not just in the streets. It was not just in the cars where you're selling $10 mixtapes that I used to sell. But anyway, it became mainstream. And they began kicking butt on black-owned radio stations. Kicking butt big time. Okay, that's when black radio said, oh, we're getting our butts whipped. We're going to be out the door unless we play this music that we didn't play before and that we said we wouldn't play and that, we don't like the message and this, that, and the other. Well, all of a sudden, hey, deregulation comes along. All the rules are gone. These stations that are called churban and rhythmic, they weren't playing no news. So the carbon copy came to follow them exactly for doing what they do. Okay, play no news, have non-broadcasting broadcasters, those that sound that like, they're from the street, have no education or what have you. That's what you're hearing. Right. That's what has continued to be successful. And yes, I agree with all of your points that there should be black news, there should be more news, there should be more activism, but then there's a dollar figure that Lee Michaels was just talking about. Okay, black radio was getting blown away by churban and rhythmic stations, your PGCs in LA, your Powers in the Bay Area, your Wild, whatever, in Chicago, your BB, whatever's out there. So
GCI,
so
GCI.
They had to, and I know time is up, but in closing, it's definitely about dollars and cents. It's definitely about copying and following the leader or get blown off the map. Putting 5-minute newscasts at 55 after the hour, okay, does not fit at that particular station. Obviously, there's also a cost factor as well, but I think more so it's a competitive factor. They're competing for entertainment, non-news. And that's what's happening with your major FMs, okay? As Teshima says, there are other outlets, okay? But the major listened stations are the ones that are top rated and have the most ratings and most ears. And yes, there needs to be a change amongst those stations, but there's this competitive thing that's been going on for about 15 years or so, right? Probably about 20 years by now.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for staying over. I'm sorry, they're going to kick us out of here. So I just want everyone to take 30 seconds for a last wrap-up comment before they kick us out.
I can do it in less than 30.
Then we'll go.
Get us down.
I know you can do it in less than 30.
I hear you saying that the motive was profit and competition, but the effect of the motive is the same. We are being fed hip-hop with no news, and it has destroyed the circle of community and knowledge that used to bind the black community together. So whatever the motive is, it still needs to change. And if you're telling me that it doesn't fit to put a 5-minute newscast in the middle of all that music when you can put in 15 minutes of commercials, and I don't mean you, Radio 1 or Syndication 1 in general, that's crazy to me.
Glenn?
Yeah, putting the money in the equation, I think that's very appropriate. I have no illusions about a change coming from the FCC. In fact, we didn't get 21 black radio reporters in 1973 because of the FCC. It's because there was a demand, and there were many vital, energetic organizations out there that wanted their activities to be heard, and they would take over a radio station. I mean, and that was always the threat. Now, when the cost of a news operation is $300,000, management, ownership must be weighed to measure that cost by the cost of organized community groups confronting that station and what the cost would be in terms of its reputation and ultimately revenues because of that kind of confrontation. So it is incumbent upon activist black folk to recognize that their activities would be vastly enhanced if they were covered by the medium that reaches the masses of black people, and bring to bear whatever resources they have against those stations that broadcast to our people but do not provide news. It's going to be our job, not the FCC's. Eventually, if we do that, the FCC will respond.
Okay. Todd, he's taken up some of your minute.
I'll take 10 seconds. There are so many people out here who are doing radio news, documentaries, etc. Syndication One and other black media companies, we want to pick just on Syndication One, but since they're the most powerful and since they claim they care, they should look into people who are doing these independent documentaries and air them. Not have Michael Eric Dyson interview somebody, air them.
We're open to that. It's not that we're not going to do that, or we may not be doing that now. We may have these other things going on.
Well, your show's open.
I mean, we want to do. Don't say we don't want to do that. We're here. Myself, Lee, Teshima are here to do this, to do what you guys been asking to do. Okay, and whatever ideas, including a documentary or what have you, yes, we're open to that. We played the memorial, the King Memorial. So we played the entire thing. Mm-hmm. Okay, the other day, what was the one we had just last week?
Oh, we did the State of the Black Union.
The State of the Black Union. We played the entire thing. Okay, we've got.
I want to fuck you by Akon 1,000 times a week.
I'm talking about Syndication One. I'm talking about Syndication One.
Balance out what your commercial stations are doing.
I'm not talking about the commercial stations. Okay, I understand that. That's what I was saying. I'm talking about Syndication One.
And when the radio station's ratings go to the cellar,
I don't listen.
They will
it's
change.
The children who are conditioned to listen.
Tell your kids stop listening.
But we're talking about Syndication One. I don't understand you're upset about hip hop and what they play.
You really believe the words that are coming out of your mouth?
Now, gentlemen, please, now.
I have 4 children from 35 years
But
old.
The bottom line,
you know
Syndication One. We're open to that.
We're going to definitely continue this conversation. I do want to give, since Teshima's on the panel, I want to give her the last word.
We're open to do what you want to do, what you want to do, what everybody wants to do about black news right here on Syndication One. So you have an outlet, okay?
Well,
Teshima,
the outlet is not.
Teshima, you want to have the last word, and we can wrap up.
Whatever the station is involved.
Can you let me have the 30 seconds, please? I'm so glad I brought them with me. Right? Ooh, they're rowdy. Okay, so as Lee and Kirk have been saying, our backgrounds are really very different. I come from Chicago, where I am quite familiar with activist radio, radio that has something to provide and say to the community. I am committed to that. Eric Tate worked with Michelle Norris on a documentary. I'm extremely interested in getting that to air for our listeners, because I think that the pieces that I worked on on National Public Radio and other places, beautiful sound, oral pieces, would be wonderful for our listeners who have probably been exposed to that, or maybe not. It doesn't matter. We want to try several different things. And you're right, maybe what we're doing at Syndication One does not balance out what is happening on Radio One. And I offer you no excuse for that. I don't know. All I can tell you is what we're trying to do on Syndication 1 and on XM radio station. I didn't know anything about public radio until someone exposed me, and then I became a junkie. All I'm saying is expose the young people to other things, and they will figure out that there's something else out there. We've got to expose them, and that's what we're in the process of doing. Other than that, I'm sorry, I don't have any explanation for you.
Thank you, Teshima. Thanks, the panel. It's been nothing but lively.